The war was finally over, after years of battles, loss, and fear. The humans had won a decisive victory against the Karen Dominion. The alien empire had been strong, proud, and feared by many. But now they had been forced to sign a peace treaty to mark the end of the conflict. The Karen High Council invited the leaders of the human fleet to their capital world Zereth Prime. It was a glittering city of silver towers, flowing sky bridges, and lights that looked like constellations pulled down to the ground. Among the guests was Soldier Dan. He was not a commander or a decorated admiral, but he had become a hero during the last days of the war, when a Karen superweapon had targeted both human and neutral worlds. Dan had led a desperate mission deep into enemy lines, destroying the weapon and saving billions of lives. The council wanted to reward him. The banquet was held in the Hall of Starlight, a vast chamber with a ceiling of crystal, letting the night sky shine through. Golden trays of alien fruits, steaming plates of food from many worlds, and music played on strange, melodic instruments filled the air. Every guest wore their finest clothing. The Karen nobles stood tall and elegant, their skin tones shimmering with faint metallic hues. The human officers wore their dress uniforms, polished until they reflected the light. Dan, however, did not feel comfortable. He was a soldier, not a court man. He shifted in his chair, glancing at the long table where the Karen royal family sat. The High Emperor himself was present, his crown a ring of woven silver leaves. When the speeches ended, the Emperor rose. His voice carried across the hall, clear and deep. "Soldier Dan of Earth," he said, "you have earned a gift of your choosing. In our tradition, a hero may take from the royal court a reward, be it wealth, a title, a starship, or even the hand of a princess. Whatever you wish, it shall be yours." The hall went silent. All eyes turned to Dan. Some humans looked excited. What would he ask for? A fleet of ships, gold beyond measure. Dan stood up slowly. He looked along the royal table. There were treasures, displayed ornate chests of rare gems, devices of advanced technology, ceremonial swords made from crystal steel. And there were the princesses, tall, graceful, with shining skin and fine clothes, all but one. At the far end of the table sat a young woman in a plain gray robe. Her hair was dull compared to the others, her features unremarkable by Karen's standards. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded neatly on the table. Dan noticed that no one spoke to her. Even the servants seemed to avoid her. The whispers in the hall were easy to hear. "That is Princess Vara, the plain one. Why? Is she even here?" Dan's eyes lingered on her. Something in the way she sat still, patient, almost invisible, caught his attention. He stepped forward. The hall waited. "I choose." Dan's voice was steady, but the pause made the nobles lean in. "Princess Vara." The silence that followed was almost physical. Then came the shocked murmurs. Did he just say Vara? He must be joking. Out of all the treasures, why her? Even the Emperor raised his eyebrows. "You are certain, human? The princess you speak of is not considered a jewel of our court." "I'm certain," Dan replied. "I choose her." Princess Vara finally looked up. Her eyes were a deep, stormy blue, not the bright metallic sheen of the other Karen royals. For a moment, Dan thought he saw a flicker of surprise there, but it quickly vanished. She rose and bowed to the Emperor, then stepped forward with quiet dignity. The Emperor's tone held both curiosity and mild amusement. "As tradition demands, the chosen gift cannot be refused. Princess Vara, you will accompany Soldier Dan to his world." The music started again, but it was softer now. People whispered behind fans and glasses. Some looked at Dan with confusion, others with pity. A few looked at Vara with open disapproval. Dan didn't care. He offered Vara his arm, and after a brief hesitation, she accepted it. Her touch was light, almost unsure. Later, as the banquet ended, the human officers questioned him. "Dan, what were you thinking?" Captain Reed asked. "You could have taken a warship, man, or a vault of Karen gold." Another soldier said. Dan shrugged. "I didn't come here for gold or ships. I came here to see the war end. She's part of that ending." The others shook their heads, muttering. But Dan noticed something. Vara was walking beside him. silent, but her pace matched his exactly, as if she was curious. As the night ended and the guests began to leave, Dan looked back at the Hall of Starlight. The nobles were still whispering, but their opinions didn't matter to him. He didn't know exactly why he had chosen her. He only knew one thing: he had seen something in her eyes, something no one else in that room had noticed, and he was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, the great silver towers of Zirth Prime gleamed under the twin suns. The human delegation prepared to return home. Their ships waited at the grand spaceport, sleek metal birds ready to leap into the dark sea of stars. Dan walked beside Princess Vara, their steps echoing on the polished stone floor of the palace corridors. Servants passed them, bowing to Dan with polite formality, but offering only shallow nods to Vara. It was not hard to notice that she was not loved here. When they reached the departure hall, Dan could feel eyes following them. Noble families in fine robes stood in clusters, whispering. Their glances carried amusement, disbelief, and sometimes pity. One voice was louder than the others. The human chooses the plain flower over the garden's finest blooms, a tall Karen noble said to his companions. Perhaps human vision is weak. Laughter followed, smooth and sharp. Dan did not react. He had spent enough time among soldiers to know when someone wanted a fight. He wasn't here for that. Still, his jaw tightened. Vara kept her head lowered, her face calm, but Dan noticed her fingers tightening around the strap of the small travel bag she carried. When they boarded the transport shuttle to the human flagship, Dan chose a seat near the large observation window. Vara hesitated for a moment, then sat beside him. Outside, the curved horizon of Zirth Prime began to shrink as the shuttle lifted into the sky. Dan broke the silence. You don't like looking at your city. Vara kept her gaze on her hands. It is not mine to claim. I was only ever a shadow in it. That's a strange thing for a princess to say. She gave the smallest smile, though it faded quickly. A princess in name, perhaps, but not in worth, at least, not to my people. The shuttle shook gently as it passed through the upper atmosphere, the deep blue sky fading into the blackness of space. Stars began to appear like cold, distant fires. Dan watched her out of the corner of his eye. She had the stillness of someone used to being overlooked, someone who had learned to survive without attention. He had seen that look before in soldiers who worked hard without medals, in people who carried burdens without asking for help. You didn't ask why I chose you, Dan said finally. Vara turned her head slightly. Would it matter if I did? It might, he replied, but I'll tell you anyway. You were the only one who wasn't trying to impress me. That tells me something. What does it tell you? She asked, her voice calm. That you're real. For a moment, her eyes met his. They were not bright like polished metal, but deep, like storm clouds hiding distant lightning. When the shuttle docked with the human flagship Resolute, the crew greeted Dan with cheers. Some were confused by the quiet alien woman following him, but no one questioned him openly. Captain Reed met them at the airlock. Welcome aboard, Princess, he said with careful diplomacy. Thank you, Vara replied, bowing slightly. Her words were polite, but her tone was cool. Reed glanced at Dan with a small smirk. I'm sure you'll explain this later. Later, Dan agreed. The Resolute was a massive ship, rows of shining carters, observation decks with wide windows, and a hum of engines that felt steady underfoot. Vara moved silently beside Dan as they walked through the ship. Crew members gave curious looks, but kept their distance. Dan stopped at a viewing deck where the stars stretched endlessly across the darkness. He nodded toward the wide glass. You should see this up close, he said. Vara hesitated, then stepped forward. The sight seemed to catch her breath. Thousands of stars, clusters glowing like scattered jewels. A nebula in the far distance like a pale cloud. I have seen stars before, she said softly, but never like this. Different view from a war room, huh? Dan asked. She turned to look at him. Is that where you spent your days? Mostly, he said. Sometimes on the ground, sometimes in the middle of fire. And yet, you smile. Someone has to, Dan replied. That evening, in the officers' dining hall, the air was full of quiet chatter. Dan and Vara sat at a small table near the corner. The human crew kept their distance, unsure how to approach a Karen princess. Dan noticed she barely touched her food. Not to your taste. I'm not used to human flavors, she admitted. He pushed a small plate of fruit toward her. Try this. It's from a neutral colony. Not too strange. She took a piece carefully and bit into it. For the first time since they met, he saw her expression soften in something like surprise. It is sweet, she said. Better than Karen nutrient paste? A faint laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Dan smiled. There what is, proof that you can smile without the whole court judging you. Later, as the ship cruised quietly through space, Dan stood in the hallway outside the quarters assigned to Vara. He hesitated before knocking. When the door opened, she looked at him with calm curiosity. I wanted to say, Dan began. I know people talk. They'll talk more on Earth. But it doesn't matter to me. Why? She asked. Because I didn't choose you for them. I chose you for me. And I think I'll be glad I did. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You are a strange man, Soldier Dan. Strange is sometimes good. He replied. Vara's eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat longer. Then she gave a small nod. Perhaps. When the door closed, Dan walked back to his quarters, unaware that for the first time in years, Princess Vara was looking at the stars from her window without feeling alone. The human flagship Resolute glided through the dark sea of space. Stars moved slowly across the wide viewing decks, and the deep hum of the engines was like the heartbeat of the ship. It had been 3 days since they left Zerith Prime. The trip to Earth would take 2 more weeks. Life on board had settled into a steady rhythm. For most of the crew, it was just another voyage. But for Dan, the days felt different. Princess Vara was not like any other passenger he had escorted before. She kept to herself, spending most of her time in the quarters assigned to her or in quiet corners of the observation decks. When she walked through the corridors, crew members often turned to watch. Some looked curious, others wary. Dan had noticed a few whispers, but they were softer here than they had been on Zerith Prime still. He could tell she was not used to attention, even the quiet kind. One morning, Dan found her sitting alone in the ship's garden chamber. It was a small space, a luxury for long voyages, a dome filled with green plants, soft light, and the faint sound of water trickling from an artificial stream. She was seated on a bench, holding a small datapad in her lap. Didn't think you were the gardening type, Dan said as he approached. Vara looked up. I'm not, but this place is peaceful. Dan sat beside her. Better than the noise of the banquet hall, right? She gave a faint nod. At court, there's always noise. Words without meaning. Eyes without kindness. He leaned back, resting his arm along the back of the bench. Sounds like you won't miss it. Perhaps not, she said, though her voice carried a shadow he couldn't name. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the quiet stream. Finally, Dan nodded toward her datapad. What are you reading? History, she replied, of Earth. That caught him by surprise. And what do you think of us so far? Her lips curved slightly. You're stubborn, quick to fight, quick to protect, sometimes reckless, sometimes noble, sometimes both at once, Dan said with a grin. Yes, Vara agreed softly. Later that day, the ship passed through a meteor field. Tiny fragments of rock streaked across the black outside, glowing faintly as they skipped off the ship's shields. Many crew members gathered on the main viewing deck to watch. Dan spotted Vara near the far window, her hands resting lightly on the railing. She was completely still, her gaze fixed on the dancing streaks of light. He walked up beside her. Pretty, isn't it? Yes, she said quietly. It reminds me of something from home. What's that? A festival. Long ago. Lights in the sky to mark the passing of seasons. It was before things changed. Dan didn't push for more. He could tell from her voice that it wasn't a happy memory. That evening, the ship's mess hall was quieter than usual. Most crew were on duty or resting. Dan found Vara sitting with a cup of tea, staring into it like it held some secret. You okay? He asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She looked up slowly. I have been wondering. Why you truly chose me, I told you, Dan said. Because you weren't pretending to be something you're not. That is not enough reason to take me from my world, Dan shrugged. Maybe I saw someone who didn't deserve to be left behind. Someone worth knowing. Vara's eyes searched his face for a moment, as if looking for a hidden meaning. Then she lowered her gaze. You do not know me. Not yet, Dan agreed. But I will. The next day brought an unexpected event. While passing through a calm region of space, the ship's sensors picked up a small drifting craft. It was damaged, with no clear markings. Captain Reed ordered a scan. No life signs. The science officer reported. But it's not old. Damage looks recent. Dan joined the team sent to investigate. Vara asked to come, but Reed hesitated. Dan spoke up. She might see something we don't. Different eyes. Reluctantly, the captain agreed. The boarding shuttle latched onto the damaged craft. Inside, they found a small cargo bay and a pilot's seat empty. The air was thin but breathable. Vara moved slowly, her eyes scanning every surface. She paused near a wall panel and touched it lightly. This is Karen design, she said quietly. Dan frowned. You're sure? Yes, and this is not a merchant vessel. It is a messenger's craft. Whoever flew this was carrying something important. Important enough to be attacked? Dan asked. She nodded once. Yes. Back on the Resolute, the recovered data from the ship's logs was scrambled. But a few fragments remain, Vara. Read them silently before handing the pad to Dan. The message was incomplete, but one phrase stood out in the translated text. Ensure the princess is never found. Dan glanced at her. That's about you, isn't it? Vara's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly. Perhaps, Vara, Dan said, lowering his voice, if someone's still after you, we need to be ready. She met his eyes. And if I told you my life has been lived in shadows for this very reason, would you still have chosen me? Yes, Dan said without hesitation. For the first time, she seemed caught off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, then turned away, her voice almost a whisper. Then perhaps I will tell you the truth, but not yet. That night, as the Resolute sailed quietly through the stars, Dan stood on the observation deck alone. He didn't know what secret Vara carried, but he knew one thing: choosing her had just become far more complicated than he imagined. And he wasn't walking away. The Resolute was halfway to Earth when the trouble started. It began as a faint shudder underfoot. Dan had been in the training room, running through a combat drill with two younger crew members. When the floor trembled, the lights flickered for a second, then steadied. The ship's alarm system stayed silent. But Dan knew the feel of trouble. Years in battle had taught him that. Moments later, Captain Reed's voice came over the intercom. All security personnel report to stations. We have company. By the time Dan reached the bridge, the situation was clear. A small, fast-moving vessel was trailing them. No official markings. No ID codes. They've been shadowing us for 10 minutes, Reed said, eyes fixed on the display, not responding to hails. Vara stood near the rear of the bridge, her hands clasped in front of her. Dan could see she was tense, though her face remained calm. Pirates? Dan asked. Maybe. Reed replied, but they're keeping just out of weapons range, like they're waiting. The pursuing ship didn't attack. Instead, it sent a short, encrypted signal, strange patterns of sound that didn't match any standard language. Vara's head turned sharply toward the speakers. You understand that? Dan asked. Her gaze flicked to him, then back to the display. Yes, it is an old Karen code. Few remember it now. What does it say? Reed asked. Vara hesitated. It says, deliver the princess. The bridge went silent. Reed's eyes narrowed. And if we don't, they will board, Vara said simply. Reed swore under his breath and ordered the crew to maintain speed. Dan pulled Vara aside. You knew this might happen. I suspected, she admitted quietly. The message craft we found, it was a warning. My disguise was meant to protect me from enemies inside the Dominion. But it seems they are willing to cross into human space to find me. Then it's time you told me the full truth, Dan said. Vara's eyes met his for a moment. He thought she would refuse. Then she nodded. Not here. Follow me. She led him down through the ship's quiet lower decks, past storage bays and empty maintenance quarters, until they reached the small passenger quarters assigned to her. Inside, she closed the door and pressed her hand to a silver clasp at her throat. Dan noticed it had strange markings etched into it, patterns he hadn't seen before. "This," she said, "is what hides me." The clasp opened with a faint click. A shimmer ran over her form like ripples over water. Dan blinked. Her dull hair brightened, becoming strands of silver that caught the light. The gray of her eyes deepened into swirling blue, like the heart of the storm. Across her skin appeared faint, luminous markings, delicate patterns like starlight traced into her very flesh. "Vara," Dan said slowly, "this is not what I expected. This is what I truly am." She said quietly, "The royal bloodline of the Karen carries a unique trait our bodies can store and release, a form of radiant energy. It is both a symbol and a power. For generations, it has been sought after, feared, and too often used, and you hid it by making yourself look plain. Yes, my family believed that if I appeared unremarkable, I would be safe. But, in truth, it only made me powerless in the court, easier to ignore, easier to remove." Dan frowned. "So the people chasing us, they want that power?" She nodded once. "And they will not stop until they have it." The ship shuddered again. Over the intercom came the voice of the tactical officer. "Captain, enemy vessel is closing in. They'll be in range in 2 minutes." Vara's gaze stayed steady. "If they board, they will target me first. You must keep them from reaching me." Dan shook his head. "No, if they want you, they'll have to go through me." Her eyes softened, just slightly. "You are a strange human." "I've heard that before," he said with a faint smile. The attack came fast. The enemy ship darted forward, firing. Control bursts, not enough to destroy, but enough to force the Resolute to slow. Grappling lines shot out, latching onto the human vessel. Dan and the security teams moved to the main docking corridor. He checked his rifle, then looked back. "At Vara, stay behind cover. No heroics." She almost smiled. "I think you are the hero here, Soldier Dan." The boarding doors hissed open. Figures in dark armor poured in, slim, fast-moving, their faces hidden by masks. They carried short-range plasma weapons and moved with practiced coordination. Dan's team returned fire. The corridor erupted in bursts of light and sound. Dan moved forward, pushing the intruders back step by step. One of the masked attackers broke off, slipping around a side corridor toward Vara's position. Dan saw it out of the corner of his eye. "Vara, down," he shouted. The attacker raised a weapon, then there was a sudden burst of light. Not from a gun, from Vara herself. It was like watching starlight explode in human form. The faint patterns on her skin flared, glowing brighter, and a wave of pale blue energy burst outward. The attacker was thrown back as if struck by an invisible force, their weapon clattering to the floor. The corridor fell silent for a heartbeat. Even Dan's soldiers stared. Vara stood still, her expression calm, though her breathing was quick. "I told you," she said softly, "the royal bloodline carries power." Dan grinned despite himself. "Remind me to stop worrying about you." The enemy, realizing they were outmatched, retreated to their ship and disengaged. The Resolutes. Shields flared as the attackers sped away into the dark. On the bridge, Ree gave Dan a look. "I'm guessing you just saw something important." "You could say that," Dan replied, glancing at Vara. She had replaced the clasp, her glow fading, her features returning to the plain disguise. But Dan knew now. And he also knew that whatever danger lay ahead, it was bigger than either of them had thought. That night, in the quiet of the observation deck, Vara stood beside him. The stars reflected in the glass, making her silver hair shimmer faintly even. In disguise, "You should regret choosing me," she said quietly. "I don't," Dan replied. "Even if it brings more danger?" "Especially then," he said, "because I didn't choose the safe option. I chose the right one." For a moment, she looked at him with something like gratitude. Then she turned back to the stars, her voice just above a whisper. "Then perhaps I was right to let you." The enemy ship had vanished into the darkness of space, But Dan knew it was not over. Hunters like that didn't just give up, they waited, followed, and struck when the target was most exposed. For the next 2 days, the Resolute kept its course toward Earth. The crew stayed on alert. Patrols doubled, shields stayed at full strength, and Dan spent more time with Vara. They often met in the Garden Dome. It had become their quiet place somewhere away from the noise of the bridge and the tension of the soldiers. One evening, Dan found her standing beside the stream, running her fingers lightly through the cool water. She was still in her plain disguise, but he had seen what was beneath it. "You've been quiet," he said. "I have been thinking," she replied. "About what?" "About how a stranger has risked his life for me without asking for anything in return." Dan shrugged. "Maybe I'm not good at thinking of myself first." Her eyes searched his face for a moment. "That is dangerous, maybe. But it's also human," he said with a small smile. Later, in the ship's training hall, Dan asked Vara to join him. She looked at the padded sparring mats and raised an eyebrow. "You think I should learn to fight like a soldier?" she asked. "I think you already know how to fight," Dan said, remembering the burst of energy she had unleashed. "But there might be times when you can't use that power. Then you need something else, at first." She moved stiffly, unused to human combat stances. But Dan was patient, step by step. He showed her how to block, how to strike, and how to use her balance against a stronger opponent. "You fight differently," she observed after a while. "How so?" "You do not try to win quickly, you try to last. That's the trick in a real fight," Dan said. "You don't have to look pretty doing it, you just have to still be standing when it's over." That night, the ship's long range sensors detected faint energy trails too faint for normal tracking, but enough for Reed to suspect they were still being followed. In the briefing room, Reed tapped the screen. "They're keeping just out of our sensor range, using debris, fields, and asteroid shadows to hide. Whoever they are, they're patient." Dan crossed his arms. "They know we can't stay on high alert forever. They'll wait for the right moment." Vara stood near the table, her voice calm. "They will wait for when you are close to your destination. That is when security drops, and if you dock at a station, they can strike in the chaos." Reed frowned. "You've seen this before." "Yes," she said. "In the court, I learned that enemies strike not when you are far from safety, but just before you reach it when you believe you are safe." The captain decided to change course, taking a longer path through a dense nebula. It would slow them down, but it would also make it harder to track them. The nebula's clouds glowed faintly outside the ship's windows, painting the corridors in shifting blue and violet light. For a while, the crew began to relax. That was when the power flickered. "Report," Reed ordered over the comms. "Unknown interference." The engineering officer replied. "It's not the nebula, it's a targeted disruption." Dan's instincts flared. "They're here." In moments, alarms echoed through the ship. A smaller vessel had slipped in close, using the nebula as cover. Instead of docking, it was sending small, unmanned drones fast, spider-like machines that clamped onto the hull and began cutting. Dan grabbed his rifle and turned to Vara. "Stay close, but stay behind cover." "I will not hide while others fight," she said firmly. "You're not hiding, you're surviving." "There's a difference," Dan replied. But he could see from her expression she wasn't going to obey easily. The first breach came near the lower maintenance deck. Dan and his team rushed there, cutting down the drones as they tried to push. Inside, sparks flew, and the air filled with the hiss of venting steam. One drone slipped past and skittered down the corridor toward the passenger quarters. Dan moved to intercept, but Vara was faster. She stepped forward, removing the clasp from her neck. Light rippled over her form as her true self emerged, silver hair, glowing markings, eyes like storms. The drone hesitated, as if scanning her. Then she raised her hand, and a sharp wave of blue light burst outward. The drone sparked, collapsed, and lay still. Dan lowered his rifle. "Remind me to thank whoever taught you that." Vara's voice was calm. "No one taught me. It is part of me." The fight lasted 15 minutes, but eventually the Resolute's gunners destroyed the remaining drones. and forced the enemy vessel to retreat deeper into the nebula. In the aftermath, Reed called a meeting in the strategy room. They're not trying to destroy the ship. They're targeting you, Princess, he said bluntly. I know, Vara replied. Dan spoke before Reed could continue. Then we plan for it. No more waiting for them to make a move. We choose the ground. Reed looked at him. You're suggesting a trap. Yes, Dan said. We give them a target they can't resist, but we make sure it's on our terms later. In the quiet of the garden dome, Vara stood with Dan again. The ship's lights were dim, and only the soft glow of the plants lit their faces. You are risking much for me, she said. I told you before, Dan replied. I didn't choose the safe option. I chose the right one. Vara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, when this is over, and if we survive, I will tell you everything. Not just who I am, but why I am hunted. Dan nodded. I'll hold you to that. Somewhere out in the nebula, unseen in the shifting clouds, they're hunters. We're still waiting. But now, Dan and Vara were ready, and the next move would be theirs. The nebula stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a cloud of shimmering blue and violet gas that hid both light and danger. The Resolute moved slowly, its engines barely leaving a trail, and every crew member was alert. Dan stood on the observation deck, watching the shadows twist in the nebula outside. He knew the enemy was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment. Vara joined him silently. Her disguise was on again, hiding the glow beneath her silver hair, but Dan could sense the power coil just beneath the surface. They're clever, she said softly. They won't attack openly. They will try to divide us, force mistakes. Dan nodded. Then we'll make them play our game. The plan was simple but risky. The Resolute would appear vulnerable, with only a minimal shield signature, making it seem easy to attack. In reality, hidden compartments were full of ready defense drones, and the crew had prepared ambush points. Dan briefed the security teams in low voices, showing them every detail on the tactical map. Vara watched, absorbing every movement, learning how the humans prepared for war. You're not afraid? Dan asked her quietly. I have faced worse inside my court, Vara replied. This is different, but not dangerous enough to stop me. Dan glanced at her. He liked her courage, but he also knew she had power she hadn't fully revealed. He wasn't sure the enemy knew it either. That would give them an advantage. The first strike came just before they were about to exit the nebula. A cluster of small ships, sleek and black, darted out from the shadowed clouds. They were fast, coordinated, and clearly prepared for an ambush. Positions, Dan shouted. The crew leaped into action. Drones unfolded from hidden compartments, auto turrets whirred to life, and the Resolute's shields flared. Vara stood beside Dan in the command center, her hand hovering near the clasp at her throat. He could feel her energy, tense and ready. They'll split us, she warned. Some will come at the front, others at the sides. Their goal is to reach me. Not on my watch. Dan said. The attack was sudden and chaotic. Enemy ships swarmed, trying to penetrate the main shields. Dan coordinated the crew, giving orders while moving along the bridge to direct fire manually. Vara activated the clasp. Light rippled over her body, and a soft blue glow extended outward. The energy didn't destroy the ships directly, but it interfered with their sensors, making it difficult for them to aim accurately. Good timing, Dan muttered, moving to fire on an enemy vessel that had slipped past the first line of drones. Vara's glow intensified slightly. A pulse shot outward, pushing several attackers away. Sparks danced across the hull of the nearest enemy ships, and Dan's soldiers cheered. For the next 10 minutes, the battle raged. The Resolute moved like a predator, its drones swarming the attackers, cutting them off one by one. Dan and Vara coordinated in silence, their teamwork unspoken but perfect. One enemy ship broke through to the docking bay. Dan grabbed a small squad and prepared to intercept. Vara followed him, her glowing patterns lighting the corridor like starlight. The intruders were fast, but not prepared for her. She released a pulse of energy that sent it sliding across the floor. Dan shot another, and the squad advanced in unison. Within moments, the boarding party was neutralized. Back on the bridge, Captain Reed watched the final attackers retreat. "I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "You'd have just turned the tide of that battle." Dan smiled faintly. "We did it together. She's stronger than most people realize." Vara, now calm again, lowered the clasp. Her glow faded, and she returned to her plain appearance. But the respect in the room had changed. No one questioned her presence now. The enemy ships were grouped far away, clearly recessing. Dan and Vara had made their point. They were not easy prey. Later, in the quiet of the garden dome, the two stood side by side. The nebula's glow filtered through the dome, painting everything in pale blues and purples. "You didn't tell me you could do that," Dan said. "I didn't want to show it until necessary." Vara replied, "I only use it when I must defend myself or those I trust." "You can trust me," Dan said. "I've chosen you. I meant it." Her eyes softened, briefly catching the light of the nebula outside. "You are very human," she said. "Unpredictable, stubborn, and brave, perhaps. That is why you see me as I am." The rest of the journey to Earth was tense, but uneventful. The enemy had been forced to retreat for now, but both Dan and Vara knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. During the voyage, Vara revealed more about her world. She spoke of politics, rival factions, and the danger she had lived with all her life. Dan listened closely, never judging, always asking questions. "I have never met someone like you," she said one evening, her voice quiet. "A human who sees beyond appearances, who acts for what is right instead of what is expected." "And I've never met someone like you," Dan replied. "Strong, patient, and more than what anyone else sees." They shared a small smile, a moment of calm in the storm of their lives. By the time the Resolute approached Earth, a new bond had formed. Dan and Vara were no longer simply soldier and princess. They were partners, allies, and friends who trusted each other completely. Reed met them at the observation deck. "You handled that battle well. I think I speak for everyone when I say you did make a good team." Vara bowed politely. "Thank you, Captain." Dan clapped her lightly on the shoulder. "You were amazing out there. I couldn't have done it without you." For the first time, Vara allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Perhaps we are stronger together than apart." And as the Resolute descended toward Earth's orbit, both Dan and Vara knew that the true challenges were not over. Enemies still lurked in the shadows of space. Factions from Vara's world would not rest until they had regained what they had lost, but they also knew something important. Together, they could face anything. The galaxy would remember this journey not only for the battles fought, but for the trust and courage that had grown between a human soldier and a princess who had revealed her true self. The next chapter of their story, full of hope, strategy, and human spirit, was just beginning. The Resolute glided into orbit above Earth, the blue and green planet sprawling beneath them like a jewel in the darkness. The journey had been long and dangerous, but Dan and Vara had grown stronger both as allies and as friends. Captain Reed came to meet them in the observation deck. "You've handled yourself well. The reports of your efforts have already reached Earth Command. I think I can safely say you've earned more than recognition." Dan smirked. "I didn't do it for recognition, but I'll take it." Vara, standing beside him, gave a small nod. "I did not expect to find trust or friendship among humans. I see now that I was mistaken." Their first stop was the Earth-Cairn Diplomatic Summit. Vara would formally announce her safe return, and Dan was invited as her representative from the human side. Walking into the great hall of the summit, Vara felt a strange mix of fear and pride. The hall was filled with Cairn nobles, some curious, some suspicious, others openly hostile. She could feel their eyes on her, whispering, judging. Dan walked beside her, silent and confident. The humans present gave him respectful nods. He had learned quickly that his presence alone could calm a tense situation. When Vara stepped forward to address the assembly, she removed the clasp from her neck. Her true form shimmered to life once again. Silver hair, luminous markings, and eyes like the storm-lit seas of her world. The room went silent. Gasps filled the air, followed by whispers. Many had never seen the princess like this. Powerful and radiant. "I am Princess Vara," she said clearly, her voice steady. "I have returned not just to claim my place, but to unite Karen with those who respect justice, courage, and truth." Dan stood beside her, watching as her presence commanded the room. He felt pride swell in his chest. She had survived, grown stronger, and now stood ready to lead. One of the nobles stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "You left us, princess. Why should we follow a ruler who abandons her own people?" Vara did not flinch. "I left because my life was in danger, and because I needed allies I could trust. Humans do not judge by appearances or politics, they act for what is right. They have taught me that courage and loyalty are stronger than fear and manipulation." Dan placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "She speaks the truth, and I will stand by her." The assembly murmured, some still doubtful, but others nodding in agreement. Over the next days, Dan helped Vara navigate the complex politics of her world. Together, they uncovered rival factions attempting to seize power during her absence. Many were surprised that a human soldier would be involved in Karen politics, but his actions and courage had earned their respect. Vara's people began to see her not as the plain, powerless princess they once dismissed, but as a strong leader, someone who could inspire, protect, and unite. One night, in the quiet of her royal chambers, Vara spoke with Dan. The windows opened to the twin moons of Karen, casting silver light across the room. "You have done more than I could have imagined," Vara said softly, "not just in battle, but in helping me reclaim my place." Dan shrugged. "I didn't do it alone. You were ready for this. I just made sure no one stopped you." Her gaze lingered on him. "And yet, I owe you more than my throne. You saw me for who I truly am, even when no one else would." Dan smiled. "I told you from the start. I chose you not because of appearances, but because you're real. That's the reward." Vara laughed lightly. Then perhaps the ugly princess was the wisest choice. The final day of the summit arrived. Vara formally reclaimed her throne. The ceremony was simple but powerful. Dan stood beside her. As she took the royal seat, the Karen people cheering, the nobles bowing, and even some former critics now showing respect. As she raised her hand to address her people, she looked toward Dan. "A great victory is not measured by the battles we win alone, but by the trust we build in the allies we choose. Today, we celebrate courage, unity, and the bonds that make us stronger than fear." The crowd erupted. In applause, Dan allowed himself a small smile, knowing that together, they had changed the course of her world. After the ceremonies, Dan and Vara returned to the observation deck of the royal palace. The stars of the Karen night stretched wide above them. "You have a choice now," Vara said quietly. "You can stay on Karen and continue as my advisor, or return to your people on Earth." Dan looked out at the stars, thinking of the humans who had trained him, the battles he had fought, and the home he loved. Then he turned to Vara. "I'll stay," he said simply. "Not for duty, but because I want to. You've become more than a mission or a reward. You're a friend and perhaps something more." Vara's eyes softened, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "Then I am glad. You have chosen wisely." In the weeks that followed, Earth and Karen formed a new alliance. Trade routes opened, cultural exchanges began, and both planets benefited from the courage and initiative of two people who had trusted each other. When the odds seemed impossible, Dan became a respected figure on Karen, teaching soldiers the value of honor, loyalty, and humanity. Vara ruled with wisdom and strength. No longer the princess hidden away, but a leader who inspired courage in others. One quiet evening, on the palace balcony, Vara and Dan watched the twin moons rise over him. The horizon. "You changed everything," Vara said. Dan smiled. "No, we changed everything together." She nodded. "Perhaps the greatest reward is not power or title. It is trust, courage, and knowing that someone believes in you even when the world does not." Dan reached for her hand. "Then I guess we both found our reward." Vara squeezed his hand gently. "Yes, and it was worth every risk." Above them, the stars stretched endlessly, a reminder of the journeys they had taken, the battles they had fought, and the adventures yet to come. The human soldier and the alien princess had proven that courage, trust, and humanity could triumph, even across worlds, and in that, the galaxy had seen the greatest truth of all, sometimes the simplest choice. Trusting someone for who they are can change the fate of entire worlds.